everyone, and good evening. Thank you again for joining us for another conversation about the OWN Network's series, David Makes Man. I'm Dr. Wizdom Powell. I'm the director of the Health Disparities Institute at UConn Health and also associate professor of psychiatry. Most recently, those of you who have been with us night after night know this, that I served as the immediate past president of the American Psychological Association's Division on Men and Masculinities. And so I'm here just to guide you and host these amazing scholar activists who have been working in the field of health equity and really advancing an agenda for boys and men of color in many, many ways. So I am ready to jump right in. And let me just introduce the first of our guests tonight. You have seen her before, and she's back with us again, Dr. Jackie Mattis, who's the Dean of Rutgers University, Newark School of Arts and Sciences. Thank you so much, Dr. Mattis, for being with us. Second, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Myles Durkee, who's an assistant professor of psychology at, guess what? U of M, Go Blue, Michigan Mafia is in the house. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being with us. And last but certainly not least, I would love to welcome my esteemed colleague and friend, Dr. Debra Furr-Holden, who is the Michigan State University CS Mott Endowed Professor of Public Health and the Associate Dean for Public Health Integration, and also the Director of the Flint Center for Health Equity Solutions. Welcome, welcome, welcome to each of you. I am so, so grateful to bring you together for tonight's conversation. I do want to give you each a moment to say a little bit about yourselves and the work that you do in the space. But before I do, let me speak to our audience. You will notice that during tonight's conversation, we will be encouraging all of you to jump in, join the conversation, ask questions on YouTube. And if you're watching on Facebook, also ask those questions there. And we will be fielding those questions at the end. So never fear. But please use this opportunity to chat amongst yourselves, the fellow people who are in the room with you, sharing the virtual space. The last thing I would say is that I want to remind you that we have created a complete digital syllabus that is available to each and every one of you. And we encourage you to pick up this companion public syllabus, which I think will help you unpack each of these episodes even long after we've finished this webinar conversation series. So, with that introduction, I want to jump in and have my very good friend, Jackie Mattis, tell us a little bit more about herself and her work. Welcome again, Jackie.
Thank you, thank you. It's just exciting to be in yet another one of these conversations. So my work, I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, but I don't do therapy. My work as a researcher focuses on spirituality and religiosity in African American and Afro-Caribbean communities. And I'm really interested in positive development, particularly again among Black folks throughout the diaspora. So my work focuses on outcomes like compassionate love, on altruism, on forgiveness. And I essentially ask the question, why do folks who are embodied and identify as Black choose to be loving, forgiving, and good in circumstances and in contexts where the challenges suggest that we wouldn't necessarily need to be?
Mm. So beautiful, so relevant, timely, and important, and so, so related to the journey that David is on. So we're so blessed by your presence. Thank you for that introduction. And Myles, welcome again. Tell us a little bit about yourself and you too.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here with such esteemed colleagues as yourself. So thank you so much for having me. So I'm trained in educational psychology, but I'm currently in the personality and social context area of psychology at the University of Michigan. And my work ultimately looks at the racial experiences of people of color. So look at how they navigate race in their day-to-day lives, how they experience racial microaggressions, sometimes more obvious explicit forms of discrimination, but also how they experience identity threats. So how people question their racial authenticity and size them up in terms of how Black are they, or accuse them of acting white if they're not fitting the metrics of being Black enough. And the last line of work I do looks at the dynamics of racial code switching. So based on those racial dynamics, many Black folks, including myself and others, have learned how to adapt and change their racial behavior, even the way they're talking, the way they carry themselves, depending on which audience and who they're talking to.
Yeah, man, do we need you in this room? Because we know that David, Saren, all of the characters in this series are doing some serious code switching. And
Hmm.
so having your expertise here to unpack that is so essential. Thank you so much for joining us. And absolutely last but not least in any kind of way, Dr. Deb Furr-Holden, thank you for being here. Tell us about your amazing work. I know all about it because, we're girls, but I want everyone else to know how amazing you are.
Yeah, great. So thanks for having me. A lot of my work is really focused on the neighborhood environment. We talk about social determinants of health in these contexts and environments where people live and work and play and age. But we don't often talk about how that really shapes
Mm.
not just people's health and health behaviors, but how they view the world, how they experience the world. And we definitely don't talk about how we can change those environments through policy, through resource allocation, and other things to really improve the context in which people live and experience life and health and opportunities for health. So my work is really about shaping, understanding, and figuring out how to create healthy environments for boys and men of color, for people who are, economically disadvantaged. And clearly, we see a lot of that. We see how the neighborhood shapes and influences so much about these boys' identities and what opportunities they have.
Absolutely. I mean, thinking through the lens of the ecologies in which men and boys are embedded is such an important part of expanding our aperture and really telling those whole stories about boys and men of color. Because sometimes we think, especially in situations like where David finds himself, that people are making rational choices, right? They're choosing to do certain things. And we see in this series that David, his friends, the people in his community, and even his mom have a set of forced choices all the time that they're negotiating and navigating. So I want to give our viewers a little bit of an episode recap for episodes 7 and 8 so that you know where we are in the story of David Makes Man. So in episode 7, Son of Man, we are introduced to this scene of Siren giving a solo at church. Most of this episode is revolving around themes of the integration of spirituality and church, trauma, how we metabolize that, and how family secrets, intergenerational traumas keep us all bound in systems of oppression and marginalization. We see this manifest both in David's life, but also in the people around him. We also see in these next two episodes something really significant happen for Siren, where Siren is confronting himself as a whole person for the first time. And we see that many things happen in these couple of episodes where both Siren and David are stepping into new found or newly acquired identities. And watching this journey unfold in these two episodes teaches us a lot about what boys and men have to confront when they're trying on new identities. There's a many different layers of that. And then the last thing that I'll say about these two episodes is that we're also dealing with now an active case of community violence where one of the children in the neighborhood actually perishes. And so it's pretty heavy couple of episodes. I think probably two of the heaviest because we're getting much more of the stories behind what has happened to David, to Gloria, and to Siren. So with that in mind, I want to jump right into these episodes, starting with Son of Man. Now we know that in this initial scene, we see Day, who's David, and Ray sitting in a car discussing their strategy for distributing prescription drugs. We also know before this episode that David has made a choice, a forced one, albeit, but a choice to take the prescription pad from Dr. Bree's office. And he does that for a number of reasons, which we can get into. I'd love to hear your thoughts about why you think he made that particular forced choice. But he does issue a warning to Ray in the beginning of this episode about what could happen if they miscalculate the amount of prescription drugs they're releasing in the environment, if they package them incorrectly. He's saying someone could get arrested or someone could die. And it's a little prophetic, as we find out later. What I want to do here for a moment is talk about this switch that I noticed in David in this particular scene. up until this point, we have seen David sort of shy away and sort of straddle the fence between the world he occupies at school and the one he occupies in his community. But in this particular episode, I think we see a different David. We see a David stepping into a choice with a newfound sense of acquisition, right? Like he's owning something different here about his identity. What's happening here for David? I'm going to start with you, Myles. What would you say um, is occurring for David in this episode around those forced choices? What do you see?
Yeah, so throughout the show, I mean, David, he's living in multiple worlds, and in each world, it's a different version of him. Okay, so it's classical code switching in this dynamic. He's one variant of himself in school. He's another variant when he's around his mom in that environment. But then when he's around Raymond and the other drug dealers in the community, he now takes this different leadership role in that space. So we start to see that leadership role for the first time now in that episode, where you can see his position in the, I'll say, amongst the hustlers in the ville in that circumstance. So what's unique about him is that he can effortlessly switch between each of these different roles. Where once he's in that role, he's he 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 executes that positionality very authentically in that role. So it's only amongst the audience who can see him being a different person across these different spaces to know that he is switching. But overall, throughout the show, I mean, you can see the exhaustion and fatigue and the way it ultimately affects him overall. And sometimes he slips out of character too. There's a few spots in the show where his code switching hits the wrong cue. You can see the reaction from people, particularly Dr. WT, when he gets so frustrated with her, he switches back to his variant back at home. And she's not used to seeing, I would say, the hood side of him when he's speaking to her in that way. And you can see across her face how she reacts to that. So yeah,
Yeah,
so I think it's great to see that as he's coming into his own manhood, how he's trying to make sense of all these different versions of his identity and trying to integrate them into one.
it's interesting that you picked up on something I saw too, Myles, which was that he doesn't, because he's developmentally still becoming. It's hard for David to keep track of which version of himself he's showing up as. I mean, he does a pretty good job, but when he gets into moments where his back is against the wall, as you said, him deciding, which part of himself to show becomes a little bit fuzzier for him. It's harder for him to discern which part of himself should he bring forward. And I love that you pointed out about how, like, in different contexts, David gets different nudges for those parts of himself to show up. And so I want to check in with Deb here about like the ecology of that. Like, you're embedded in a context like the ville, and there are expectations about how you're supposed to show up. We've been talking about rules around masculinities and how the rigidity of that can box men and boys in. But I think in contexts like the ville, it's not just about, are you going to say the wrong thing that might bring you shame? It's like, are you going to move in a way that might endanger yourself or those you care about? And so I feel that like intensity with David, that is not just about impression management here. How does the ecology that he's embedded in support or antagonize all of these identity negotiations that David is undertaking?
So that scene really struck me when he sort of lashed back at Dr. Woods and said, you're trying to shame me and I'm trying to survive. Like, here I have to navigate and play all these games to survive in my neighborhood. And I'm doing exactly what you said. Like, my heart went out for him. Like, I'm doing what you told me to do. I'm reading the cues. I'm putting things in context. And now you're trying to like shame me. What I really got is like, and I think about this in this sort of era of becoming, like how you navigate all of that. And the fact that there truly is no safe place for him to be authentically himself. Like, he's just constantly having to adapt and turn things on and off. And I could feel the just upset with getting it wrong in her eyes, when in his world, he was doing exactly what she had coached him to do. And I could get that the upset and the reaction was because you do that in the ville and it could cost you your life.
Right.
But he does that in this environment, and it costs him his sense of self. And the one place where he felt like he was winning, he was being accomplished, he was doing the right thing. And here he is now being shamed because, you know, what she perceived he was doing versus what he perceived were
Yeah.
so just disconnected. Like, I really felt for him in that moment. And I think boys of color specifically have to deal with that because they've got these very lofty and at times unrealistic expectations around performance and how they should be and what they should be doing. And it's like one false move and we, you know, people are coming at their necks,
Yeah.
whether it be their teachers, their counselors, or the guys in the neighborhood. It's a tough existence.
It really, really, truly is. And when you talked about that moment with WT, Dr. WT, you know, we've been talking over these past several nights about that, about her character, because she's a really complex. All of the characters actually are complex. Like, kudos to the writers, because there is not a singular unidimensional character in this entire thing. Like, everyone surprises you. Like, people that shouldn't be loving are loving. People that should be kind are not. Like, it's just this really interesting sort of complexity, which shows, I guess, the range and depth of all of our humanity. But when Dr. WT and Day, which is a little bit later in the scene, but I'm in the episode, but I'm glad you brought it up here because it does relate to what we're seeing in this first episode, right? This first scene, rather, of the episode. This idea that what David is saying is that you're worried about me being shamed, and I'm trying to just live. It's that respectability politics thing. You know, there was this viral article that went around a couple of years ago about this brother whose intentions, I believe, were all pure, who thought that he would get these young brothers together in ties, like young boys. I'm talking in like third grade, second grade, and he would teach them how to put on a tie, because that was his response, his protest practice in response to the myriad deaths and execution of brown and black boys. And there was a part of me that said, that's great and sweet. And then the other part of me was like, those ties aren't going to save them, right? Like, so David is saying, this respectability ain't going to save me. You're worried about me being ashamed. Like, shame is like the last thing that in the ville that I have to worry about. Everybody's shame there. Like, shame is like hangs over the sky like the clouds, right? Like, what we need is our efforts to live. And it's interesting to see, Jackie, I would love to hear your perspective about this. This sort of this the social production of shame and guilt in spaces like those, and the things that we pay attention to and the things we don't. Like, Day is really trying to negotiate a new existence right outside the ville, and can't find his footing there, and then is now having to step up and do something that he really doesn't want to do, which gets us back to that first scene, right? Like, he has made a choice. He would not have stolen that prescription pad were it not for a series of events that led him there to those forced choices, which gets us back to Deb's point about how ecologies push our boys against the wall and then look around and say, well, why did they make that choice? Well, he actually, in this instance, his choices were very limited. Talk to us about how societies, ecologies, environments produce these forced choices, and what kinds of things we can do as elders in a village, as policymakers, like to rise up to meet boys like David at their highest intentions for escape. He wants out of the ville. He did not want to be in that life.
Yeah.
And now he's finding himself pulled right into it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love the direction of the conversation. One of the things that strikes me about the forced choice, right, is there is such deep hypocrisy in, on one hand, lifting up this political figure, right, who seems to be the perfect representative of those who have made it.
Yeah.
And, the one who comes back with the narrative of the giving back.
Yeah.
And the school made a choice. And whoever in the school made that choice, the school made a choice to bring this person back.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, Dr. WT points out that he's an embarrassment, right? Which there's no way the kids in the audience would have known that, right? So he comes with all the trappings of this is what success looks like. And the school, the very institution that's supposed to be providing kids with a model of what success looks like, brings him back as a success, only to have him be a signifier of a particular kind of failure. So the one of the things that is really profound for me in this moment is the reality that we create these confusing signals for young people,
Absolutely.
in part around the performance of excellence and the performance of goodness and the performance of a particular kind of sort of made it Blackness.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't talk about the things that are going on in the background, and we don't make legitimate choices as adults, but we expect kids to unpack what the legitimate choice should be.
Mm-hmm.
Or when kids unpack the legitimate choice, we shame them for saying the reality, which is this person isn't about anything, right? Like this person is showing up in the suit and all of that, but that's not connected to my reality. So I think part of what sort of bubbles up for me in all of this is the mixed signals and the hypocrisy and the
Mm-hmm.
pressure that we then put on young people to
Yeah.
try to sort that out, and the
Yeah.
ways in which we shut them down when they do. So that's one piece of the reality. But there's also a way in which we make young people beg, right? And I think one of the things that sort of stands out for me with David is the ways in which he is forced to pander and beg, and he's learning those rules, right? The rules of you got to do the pain porn because that's what people want from you.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he does it, he gets punished for it.
Mm-hmm.
But we do that. We see it in college admissions all the time, right? And it's part of his high school admissions process. We make people do this, and we pander, and we make them beg for resources that they absolutely need.
Mm-hmm.
And then we tell them that it's wrong to have done that with no other choices of what else they could do.
All right. And no other choice. Like, that's so brilliant because it gets us right to this I am the son of man moment, right? Right? Like
Yes.
this idea that we have institutions that cover and that are not, don't authentically protect community, even though they say they do. Just like this figure, this speaker, what Jackie is sharing is there's a scene in this episode where the school invites an alum to come back and talk to the boys about success, what it means to be successful. And of course, they bring back the African American male who's made it, but who has a sort of way of presenting himself in the world that just rubs Dr. WT wrong. I mean, as soon as he started talking, I was like, she is going to not like him, right? Because she really deplores the sort of pain on display kind of approach to things. Like she believes wholeheartedly that if we show up respectably, that people will see us for all that we are. And David is saying that's actually not how it works. So she doesn't actually have all the answers either. But in this episode, we get to see how that gets birthed in an environment like the one David's in, right? Remember, this is an alum, right, who is in the same seat that David is sitting now. So it is about structures and institutions and how we cover and protect all the wrong aspects and parts of ourselves. So it gets us to the church thing. So Saren, this scene for me, like literally, if there was a scene that brought me to my knees, it was this one. So Saren, who is David's friend, as we all know by now, is giving a solo performance at the church. And he's very excited because David is going to come and bear witness to this solo. Again, there are these moments where Saren invites David into his world and David invites Saren into his, and they get to both experience both the good, the bad, and the complicated about those spaces. But we know that Saren has been subjected to a lot of abuse. Like there's physical abuse and there's obvious, although subtly presented, sexual abuse. And Saren, this morning that he picks up David on the way to church, first of all, David is profiled. Did you guys peep that? That the security officer in the community where Saren and his parents live profiled David. And the one thing that came to my mind was Trayvon Martin. I just kept thinking Trayvon, right? Like that David is walking around in a suit. He's obviously not there to cause any trouble. He's minding his own business. He's just walking, trying to get from one place to the other. And a security officer in the community decides he's going to question him. Luckily for him, the parents and Saren drove up right at that moment. But I caught that and it really stood out to me. So we can come back to that. But for me, moments where we really get to see some like real intensity around David and Saren's character is when Saren and him are in the car. And he's trying to figure out what's going on with Saren. Like Saren's unusually quiet. And the two of them have their private conversations, which I love, you know, where they're like not speaking, but they're talking to each other. It's sort of so like classic boy talk. Like boys don't really use a lot of words. It's like this nod and you know what's up, right? So that's happening in the car. But then Siren's mom turns around and she has a bruise on her face. Now, I don't know if either of you, did you get whether or not it was Siren or the dad who did that? Because she said that it was Siren. And I couldn't really imagine Siren like hitting her unless, of course, he was finally standing up for himself and fighting back. I'd love to hear what you guys made of that because I struggled with trying to figure out if it was Siren or his dad. Did you
Yeah,
feel that?
I felt the same way, and I feel like the show intentionally left it, an anomaly
Yeah.
like that. But it does sound like Saren might have, for the first time, stood up for himself, either in self-defense or maybe it was an accidental hit against his mom trying to protect himself. Because later in the episode, we start to see Saren he's coming into his manhood, and now he's pushing back against his mom, both verbally too, when he gets picked up towards the end of the episode. So they kind
Yeah,
of set the precursor there to show him coming into his sense of manhood.
absolutely. What did you think, Deb?
So I saw it a little bit different because that just didn't jive with who I saw him to be.
Yeah.
So what I thought she might have been pointing to was him standing up is what resulted in this. Not necessarily that he did it directly, but it makes more sense to me that that came from the stepdad. That might have been the fallout of Siren standing up to her or of him standing up for himself. So it doesn't matter because mom blames him either way.
That's right.
Even if he himself didn't do it directly, he was the cause of it in her eyes.
Yeah, so true. Jackie, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I saw it as I think I remember her saying something along the lines of we used to tussle, and somehow gives the impression that her beating him was them tussling, which is in and of itself deeply problematic. But I got the sense that he was trying to perhaps defend himself and ended up with her getting that bruise. And because he says, "I'm sorry, it was an accident."
Yeah.
So I read it as he was beginning to stand up for himself, and she ended up getting hurt.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that too, and then I said, let me just make sure because the dad has shown violent tendencies in a different kind of way, but certainly I wasn't really clear. But that actually makes sense given the way things turned out later, which we're going to get to. But let's start with this moment when David is moved in the church setting. So Siren is giving a beautiful solo, by the way. I was just so blown away by his voice. And right before he begins to sing, David gets up because he gets overwhelmed with flashbacks. So we're getting to see David's trauma reaction in real time. And I think that if viewers are watching this and they're not really clear about how trauma manifests, they might have missed that all of those flashbacks, the exaggerated startle, that hypervigilance that we see David displaying, that all is a trauma reaction. And what's problematic is that we often miss that. If you watch this the first time without that trauma informed or healing centered lens, you might think, well, David's just aggressive or like, what's all of this? Like, what's happening with him? It's actually trauma response. But we see David stand up after it and say, I am the Son of Man. What did he mean, Jackie? What did he mean by that?
That's such a powerful scene for me as well. And I had to go back to that scene like 3 or 4 times because I was like, that's so deep. I think I missed a lot of it. So I think there are a couple of things that means. So the Son of Man is a phrase used in the Christian community to signify who Christ was, right? So there's God, and Christ is both the Son of God and the Son of Man, right? He's the child of presumably Joseph. He was raised by Joseph at least, right? So there's that harking to Christianity. But I think in a deeper sense, that moment signifies so much about, I'm keying into the notion of hypocrisy, right? The reality that so much of modern day Christianity is about Christians who would never identify Christ and certainly would never worship Christ if they actually met him, right? Because you get this brown dude who's walking around with his boys trying to turn the government upside down and trying to change the way that people function and talking about injustice. These are the people who get vilified and harmed and killed in our communities.
And wearing sandals.
Exactly.
and a robe. I mean, just imagine, like, put yourself in that time and you're like, wait, who is this brother? Like
Yeah,
coming through talking about he's the son of man and son of Christ, right?
absolutely.
Right.
And he's hanging around with thieves. He's hanging around with folks who are walking, who's like on a moral slip and slide and have been for much of their lives. So this is not the representation of who a Christian is, and who Christ was ministering to, and who he was centering himself with, is a diametric opposite of what the sanitized versions of Christianity that people want to hold up. But David names himself as exactly who he is. Like, this is Christ. Like, this is what Christ was like. He was dealing with some mess in community. He was struggling to figure out how to do love and hold on to legacy, and trying to figure out how to make a way out of no way in a world that wasn't forgiving of who he was and how he was showing up and who he was from, right? And the places he was from. He represents Christ. And so by naming himself as that, I think that's probably the most honest religious moment I've seen on film in a long time. And for it to be positioned in a church that is obviously a middle-class church, where he's sitting next to two people who are engaged in massive sin, right? But who have the performance of piety. And so he in that moment, he just names that divide between the pretense of goodness, the pretense of Christianity, versus the reality of the grunginess of what Christianity really looks like if one sort of names it. So I think it was just a beautiful and powerful moment. But I think it speaks so much to some of the challenges that we're facing right now, where so much of so many Christian communities, evangelical and otherwise, are steeped in this inability to love God and love Christ and love Christ's those who are really living out the realities of what Christianity is supposed to be about. Who, if you're willing to cage a child, and you're not able to see how that completely violates every aspect, like that Mexican kid, that kid is Christ, right?
Absolutely.
Right. So I think it's just a beautiful and powerful moment.
You just said something that just like a light bulb went off for me, because I was thinking about that the metaphor of, like, all of us who were churched and grew up, went to church Monday night, Bible study, Tuesday night, YPW, the whole gamut. We know that this discussion around Christ and who he represents is probably one of the most controversial of in Christianity, like the whole Trinity, like all of that. But what David does in this moment is he not only says, I'm the son of man, but he's saying to the world, in some ways, metaphorically, how can you love God who you have not seen?
Right.
And not love me, a boy of color, thriving, trying to become who you see every day, right? Like, it's like a real moment. And then the whole idea that he's in a church where all of this hypocrisy is happening is also an indictment of the Black church, right?
Absolutely.
How we can sit in pews, and all this stuff's going on in our families and in our homes and in the church itself, and post up as if we're more righteous than folks who are walking around seemingly like they're struggling. So it's so much happening. It's like calling out the hypocrisy, but it's also about cleansing and rebirth. And Myles, I wondered what you thought about, like, the challenges of being reborn in a place or a context that doesn't see you as whole, right? Like that. I think that the psychological burden for David around code switching is so heavy because he has that authentic, that desire to show up as his full self. Like, he doesn't have that capacity, not easily. He's gaining it as we go through this series, but he doesn't have that natural inclination to show up as a fake person. Like, it doesn't really jive well with who he is, which is why parts of him out. And so he's in this church and he has this moment, this spiritual moment, where he's like, I'm going to be all of who I am. The raw, the ugly. I'm the son of man. I am the sinner who's come to be redeemed. Talk to us about what you're seeing in this whole scenario.
Yeah, what I really love most in the show is that the show really gives us an insight into his thought process. So I'm going to take us back a little bit. So back to his first session with Dr. Bree. when he's having the session, he's code switching the entire time. He's thinking through every single response before he gives it. But the show gives us that look into his thought process. And you kind of see the two different sides. You see the Ville side, and then you see the Galvin Middle School Magnet School side, both trying to navigate and negotiate what's the appropriate response to these questions. And I believe in that situation, when he's in church, he's still feeling that same type of pressure. So even though we don't see those two personas, they don't show it's that side of what's going on. You know, in his mind, he's going through the same dynamic of trying to channel all these different beliefs and these emotions and feeling out of place and being with his family that he knows is so problematic, and having to sit right next to Miss Kelly, who he knows all these horrible things that she's done, but yet in church, she looks like the model citizen of the church. And I think all that just comes out in that response. And I mean, Miss Kelly's response is showing where as soon as he projects that, her first response is going back into character to play the respectability politics, where she says, do you need to go to the restroom? To kind of have him exit out of the scenario. So what I was thinking while watching the show, I wasn't sure if it was a fantasy that he was having or if it really happened, because in the show, you kind of never know whether it's one of each. Exactly. But I think just all of that information going through his head was telling of how he just, it all came out all at once.
Yeah, and that spilling forward is so developmentally appropriate, right? Because, you know, the frontal lobes are still developing. I always tell folks, if I had like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter in my 20s, I wouldn't have a job right now. So at that age, it's really difficult for you to put those brakes on, right? Like, so he finds himself so wound up that he can't stop himself. I think in those moments when he can't stop himself is when we really get to see David, who he really is, right? When he's not controlling every thought, not monitoring his interior life in the ways that we see him doing so much. So Deb, I want to take us to the bill for the Halloween party. Oh, this was one of my favorite moments of this episode, because it's in this moment that we walk into this community. You and I both know, as we think about ecologies, that in every ecology, every neighborhood, every community, even if there are troubles or challenges socioeconomically, there's always a Miss Elijah. There's always some protector in the community who pumps in joy, love, understanding. And this moment when Ciaran gets to accompany David to the Halloween party and he doesn't have a costume and he has that moment alone, Ciaran has that moment alone with Miss Elijah, there's so much happening about acceptance there. Talk to us, Deb, as a mom, you know, as you watch this moment, this tender moment between Miss Elijah and Ciaran, what do you see happening, unfolding here? And what can parents who are watching this scene take away from that, about like how we talk to our boys about the fluidity, about who they are, and about acceptance and boundaries? I mean, there was so much Miss Elijah, she's like the truth. But she was sharing so much with Ciaran, and I think cleared a pathway for him in this scene. Tell us what you saw.
Yeah, there was a lot that I just found really endearing and really wonderful, that points to a lot that makes our community so extraordinary, right? So I thought it was really great when she was saying, okay, we're going to kind of piece something together for you, right? So you have a costume. Right. And are you okay with me putting some makeup on you? And if you're not, you scream it out loud to the top of your lungs. And like this really tender, so much was in the unspoken, right? And just to like, you are safe, you are okay. And if you're not, scream it out loud. Don't internalize it. Don't hold on to it. You know, I'm not going to do anything. Because I was thinking at first, I was like, this is a very significant conversation for just putting makeup on somebody. But I got like, Miss Elijah was really communicating, like, you have a voice, you are safe, and you should use that voice to ensure and secure your own safety. I loved it. And what I really super loved, which made sense to me when we got toward the end of the episode, when she put the foundation in his pocket. And you see him using the foundation later to cover his battered lip. And I just thought, like, the experience, and this is what you always want as a parent, right? And I've always said, I never wanted to be my kids' end all be all. It is so important for kids to have trusted adults, safe spaces where they can be in communication, where they can not just, you know, because adults, we love to give advice to kids, but they need to be able to express their own pain and do that in a safe place. And so I just thought it was this really great, tender exchange, where Siren left with both love and skills and a new opportunity to be fully self-expressed. So the half woman, half man costume, like all of it just all came together, and I loved all of it.
Yeah, it was so beautiful to watch Siren strut out in that costume. Like my heart leapt for him because Siren has been one of the most embattled characters of this series. His story for me was probably the hardest to watch for all the obvious reasons. One, because we rarely acknowledge sexual trauma in the lives of boys and men of color. We just don't. In our communities, it's taboo and silence. The auntie that like slept with the 14-year-old and taught him all the ways of the world. That stuff is like folkloric in communities as if it's like a rite of passage when it's actually assault, sexual assault. And we don't really talk a lot about that. That's not what happened to Siren, but it happens to many boys. And I think this series gave us an opportunity to like really talk about sexual trauma in the lives of the men of color in a profoundly deep way. And it's in that moment when Siren struts out in his costume, it's like he's coming out. And it reminds me of what a beloved community can do for queer boys and men of color when they're trying to become. It's Miss Elijah teaching Siren that he has bodily autonomy, that he gets to decide, teaching him consent, like what consent looks like, setting boundaries. It was like for a moment, Siren got to see the possibilities of what freedom looks like, which, we know is a huge theme in this show. I want to take us, and I hate to move us forward, but we haven't even talked about Bubble House yet, which is the next episode, which I know we need to get to. But I do want to say one other thing and have us grapple with something else that happens in this episode. One is David and Siren in the moonlight. Now, those of you who know the history of the series, you know that the same producer of this amazing series is also the person who's responsible for the movie Moonlight, right? So there's this moment that is kind of like a shadowing, if you will, of like the connection between this series and Moonlight. But Siren and David are sitting in the moonlight after the Halloween party has concluded, and they're comparing notes. Siren's like, "This is the most fun I've ever had." And the two of them are having this moment of male intimacy. So many of those moments show up in the show and in the series that it's just beautiful. But this moment where they're crying together, and David says to Siren, "You're like my only friend." I mean, it's just so amazing to me that they have this bond. And I don't know what drives it, what fuels it. I mean, I have my speculations, but I'd love for us to have a dialogue here, and starting with you, Jackie, about this bond. What is it that binds Siren and David together? I mean, there are probably many things, but what's your perspective about this friendship? Because I think we don't talk enough about how boys form male relationships with one another that are outside of fighting and competing over a girl, right? Like, so how what do we think is driving the intimacy and the bond here?
Yeah. I think part of what strikes me, or what I'm imagining might have created the bond, is the fact that they are the only two Black boys in a context that doesn't have a lot of Black boys, right? So they're already in a context where they're among the only. So, but that creates contact, but not intimacy.
Yeah.
Clearly, there's something that happened where early on, Siren shares something with David that fueled both the friendship violation, but also fueled their decision to come back together and to really try to figure out how to do reconciliation. And I think it's that journey, right? That it's the trust, it's the moments when Siren really like overtly shows his body to David, and so that David can see where his wounds are, both metaphorically and literally, right, on his body. And the fact that David sees him and he sees David. And I think that ability to actually literally see who the other person is beyond the surface and to name it, but also the fact that there's all this interior language and the other person doesn't need it to be exteriorized in order for it to be real or meaningful. The fact that they can just sit together, touch each other, the leaning in, that moment in the courtyard where the neighbor says something vile to Siren about, and to Miss Elijah about, don't have your sissy ways be passed on, where David wraps his arm around Siren and leans into him, right? He holds him. And so I think those moments when they show up for each other and they're intimate for each other, that's the core of their friendship. And I think they continually do that for each other.
It's really powerful because David has this capacity to see people, right?
Yes.
Like he is clairvoyant in that way. We discussed this, last night too in our conversation. And I do believe there's something about him that sees people for who they are. And he says something to Siren that I think even comforts him a bit more, because he says, well, she or he was trying to figure out which pronoun to use for Miss Elijah. And he
Yeah.
goes, it's just Miss Elijah.
Just Miss
In
Elijah.
other words, we're just human.
Yeah.
Like he's just a human being. She's just a human being. I'm a human being. It's just, there's so many like subtle lessons there. So I'm going to move us forward, but I do want to tell our viewers, remind them of where this episode ends, because there's a powerful moment. Do you remember that Sky says to David earlier on in the series, heavy is the head that wears the crown, right? And in the end of this episode, again, as Siren is stepping into his newly acquired whole self, so is David. And he revisits the room, finally, that Sky occupied. David has avoided that space for the entire series. And in this episode, he not only steps into the room where Sky last was on the day that he was murdered, and he picks up the crown and sits in the seat that Sky occupied. There's so much metaphoric meaning in his taking that seat, but heavy is the head that wears the crown. So I think we will see a lot more of that show up in the next season. But let's go to episode 8, Bubble House. And I'd like to start there with a clip. I want us to take a look at this clip from the Bubble House where there the issues of post-fictional are being sort of lifted up again, but in a different kind of way. And then I want to come back to Myles to kind of unpack this clip for us and for the viewers today. Let's go to that clip.
You see Mrs. Kelly outside?
Yes, ma'am.
She's looking for Siren. Have you seen him today?
He okay?
Here? How would you think? Is that what he told you? I want to say something about Siren. David? David.
Siren. He gave this to me a few weeks ago. I didn't think nothing of it then, but
Wait here. I'm gonna get Dr. Bree. I promise I will be right back. David, I need you to tell me what's going on right now. Siren hasn't been acting right, and I know it has something to do with you. Is he in danger? What did you do to him? I know this is your fault. Please, you won't get in any trouble, I promise. Just tell me. You look at me when I speak to you.
Yes. Mrs. Kelly, Dr. Bree.
So this is a powerful scene because we see David being confronted by Siren's mom. Now, Siren's mom has had multiple experiences with David. She's seen him in both her home and in his home in the Ville. And she's also challenged, if you will, by her own sort of thought process around racial identity. And there's so many things that she's coming forward with, and she's showing up in all of these spaces with these conflicts. So, Myles, I know that your work sort of looks at both, the intersections of identity development and negotiation within multiple spaces, particularly in education spaces. So there's a lot happening that leads up to this scene. So what I want you to do is first unpack what you think is happening here, and then talk about from your level of expertise the mom, like she has a particular expectation around code switching that's pretty interesting, but it's all tied up in her, I think, pretty convoluted ideas about racial identity, and about the identity of her son. So talk to us about what you see happening in this clip and what you think has led up to this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the mom because the mom, Miss Kelly, is such an interesting character. And you can see Miss Kelly, even having a Black son and being married to a Black man, she still internalizes so many negative and racist stereotypes about the Black race and Black people. And you can see it comes out several times throughout the show where she basically exceptionalizes Saren as a special Black boy who's different from everyone else, but then villainizes all other Black men outside of her household. And you can see the bias and stereotyping coming up in most of the ways she interacts with David. So right there, as soon as something goes wrong, she assumes that David has to be responsible for it, that David caused this because David's from the hood. So all bad things, that any trouble that Saren may get into or anything is always David's fault. So David on the other side, so David having negotiated all these different identities, you can see when he hears the buzzing sound going through his head, he's actively negotiating that code switching right there of how to respond, how to react when the Principal Fallow asks him for information of what about Saren's whereabouts. So right there, he's trying to negotiate what's the right thing to say. And it's interesting that he decided to use that as an opportunity to send a signal out for help, to help his buddy Saren right there by sharing that note, where he had that note for quite some time, but he decided that that was the ideal time really to optimize that situation because he had the attention of the principal and the school to be able to signal and reach out for help and get help for his best friend, Saren.
And there are many ways that David tries to help Saren get the kind of help that he needs and deserves. And I'm going to skip ahead because you mentioned this, and I think it's such an important parallel. So when Saren leaves the party in episode 7, we have the suspicion that Saren is going someplace, right? Because of the way that he hugs David. And you have a sense, even though you don't know it yet, that David knows something about what has happened to Saren. And in this moment, he is, quite believably even like holding back parts of the truth, right? Like it's not clear. He knows something, but you don't know the depth of his involvement until later. And what's striking about that particular later scene, and I'm only jumping there in the interest of time because we always run out of time with these rich discussions, but you see David helping him flee. And it reminds me metaphorically of like the Underground Railroad, right? It reminds me metaphorically of the Cimarron societies, right? Where there's music being sung while people are being taken to freedom. That whole steal away to Jesus like is like Black genius made manifest, right? The fact that we use freedom songs to actually help people escape away. And the fact that Saren is a singer and he's taken away in this way. There were so many moments. And David has actually helped him to get to safety, going against what Ms. Elijah says, that you can't save them all, baby. He's like, I can't save them all, but I'm going to save this one. So there's so much happening with Saren's mom around the racial identity issues, but the way that David shows up in those moments, again, reminds us of why his character is a center force for everything else that we're seeing. I want to move us ahead just a little bit because there's one particular thing that I think we want to cover for our audiences before we move into the Q&A. And that is the obvious one, and that's the death of Willie. So in this episode, very, very heavy moment, we bear witness to the homegoing ceremony for little Willie. Willie is a young boy in the community in the Ville who's gotten a hold of some of the prescription medication and is overdosed on that medication. So everyone is fraught with guilt. There are many players involved, but all of them are centrally bothered by this occurrence. But you see this moment, this ritual funeral happening. in the community, or ritual homegoing that has so many remnants of West African culture. Like I saw the Yoruba and the Igbo and they're the white, dress. There's so much there being shown about ritual and funerals, but it's also happening in the midst of a community, right? That has to go on with life. So Deb, I wonder, as you think about a lot of your work has really helped us in the world gain a more clarity about the impacts of neighborhoods that are fraught with violence, alcohol, and other drug activity, and the implications for young people's development, but also for the choices that even fully grown people make. And when I see this funeral scene happening in the middle of the community, like there was a directorial choice made there. Why, when death revisits the doorsteps of people like that live in communities like the ones we're seeing here, it doesn't show up on days where, it doesn't show up in a funeral home. It actually comes right to your doorstep. And that has implications for how communities function and also how young people heal, grow, and thrive in those spaces. So talk to us about this scene, about the Black men and young men of color's confrontation with death in everyday life, and how that shapes their development from your perspective. I think you're muted.
This where he's holding Willie. And if you think of the foreshadowing from earlier, where Dave says, you can't handle things this way. What happens if it rains? And it's really funny. He made a comment. Somebody made a comment in the episode about, oh, you have to break some eggs to make an omelet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so as I thought about that, I'm like, this is just, we almost think about these losses of life as just a natural casualty,
Right.
of what happens. But it's just, it's not the necessary lived experience for people to grow and and I just, that scene was just so powerful for me because, what's his name? Who was holding him? Shinobi. Was holding him. And you talk about the complex nature of our humanity and of all of these beings. You could tell he was heartbroken. There was a lot of turmoil brewing, saying something bad has happened. We saw Ray earlier in the episode. He was on the phone. He was upset. Like everybody was sort of. And so then for it to all come together, and then ultimately for us to then see these are the just impossible choices.
Right.
And we don't think about it as we think, we oftentimes will say, well, the other people, you have other choices, or there are other opportunities, or, not everybody in the neighborhood has gone this route. But when you really look at, people choose from what's available to them, and the familial bond, the nurturing that all of these guys have in these very complex relationships. This kid almost was like driven to this path.
Yeah.
And his death took a toll on everybody because obviously that wasn't the goal.
Right.
And so it says something about when you really think about how neighborhoods and how communities and even within neighborhoods, right? You've got the ville, you've got this, apartment complex where everybody lives, you've got this, the neighborhood mom and all of these other things. You still end up with people who find themselves in young kids in these circumstances that literally cost them their life. We're talking about identity, but there's real loss of life, that comes with this, and it impacts everybody. Everybody was impacted by Willie's death. And I think you just got to see that and feel it and experience it.
Yeah, and it was so much of a visceral experience to me that I actually skipped ahead. I think that's episode 9 where we see the funeral. Willie
Yeah.
dies. Willie dies in episode 8, or
He dies in episode 8, and we see him
the funeral in episode 9.
Yeah.
So come back tomorrow night. We're going to talk more about that funeral. But certainly there was so much in these 2 episodes, and again, we're seeing David become. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight for this conversation as we unpacked episodes 7 and 8 of David Makes Man. I also want to remind you that we'll be here again tomorrow night and that tonight, in a few moments, we're going to be taking some of your questions and answering those live. Before I depart tonight, thank you all for this dope conversation. I want to thank Debra Furr-Holden, Jacqueline Mattis, Myles Durkee. Like, I could talk all night with the three of you about many things, but this has been such a gift. And I hope that all of you have enjoyed listening in to us as we unpack the episode. Don't forget that after we have our Q&A, go check out the public syllabus. Okay, let's start answering some of these questions. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for another webcast conversation about season 1 of David Makes Man. I'm Dr. Wizdom Powell, and I'm joined here tonight in our Q&A studio with Dr. Debra Furr-Holden. Welcome back, Dr. Furr-Holden, and welcome to all of you who have listened in tonight as we unpacked the 2 episodes, The Son of Man and Bubble House. I hope that you gleaned a lot of insights from our discussion, but more importantly, we hope that you are taking some time to grapple with some of the themes yourself and that you've also had an opportunity to review the public syllabus. We're going to wait for a moment to see if there are questions that come in, but Dr. Furr-Holden, as we were reviewing tonight's webcast and listening into the conversation, there were a couple of things that stood out to me in terms of the synergy around our discussion. And one of them was about the role of environments and how they shape life course outcomes for our boys and men of color. And there was a moment in the webcast where we were talking about the love that's poured into communities by the myriad mix of characters, reflecting, of course, on the character of Miss Elijah and the moment in the episode 7 where Siren is having a conversation with Miss Elijah and she is helping him establish boundaries. You said something really profound about the role of parents and the need for us to lean in and provide a brave and safe space for our children to be cared for. So I just, in rewatching that, I just was so drawn to that scene again and drawn to the commentary. Anything else you want to add for our viewers tonight?
Honestly, Dr. Powell, is that what we're doing tonight? Are you Dr. Powell tonight? And
I can be Auntie Wiz. I can be.
I know. Can I call you? I'll just call you Dr. Wiz.
Yes.
I had to go back and watch the episode. I actually, I really acknowledge you for bringing me into this conversation because the role of Black media and the way we get to tell stories and the way we get to portray things and really challenge people. It's not just entertaining people, right? It's good watching, and it also gives us an opportunity to stop and reflect. So to be honest, I went back and I started all the way from the beginning because I really wanted to be more steeped in it. And I said, man, these sisters and these brothers got it down. And it's a good thing. This is a great opportunity. And so when I went back and I really looked, a couple of things popped out for me. as I thought more about the environment and the context, it's specifically because we're focusing on boys and men of color. When I went back and looked at that episode and I saw how it started, it was this really great bubble house, this really great scene of Shinobi in the pharmacy. And he's having just this really, sort of endearing and warm interaction with this older white woman in the pharmacy. And I thought, here's a guy who is living in circumstances that not only can most people not identify with, especially the woman he was talking to, but he had a moment of just relating human being to human being. And then he literally leaves that and he goes to be with Miss Elijah. And they're about to have this sort of sexual interaction, which gets interrupted. And in that moment, I thought, wow, it opened with him having an opportunity and an experience to just be, and just be in an environment and in a space that might not have been, sort of what we classically think about, but it's just human to human interaction. And then he has this experience where he gets to express 360 degrees of his sexuality. And then as that episodes unfold, you watch how the environment that he lives in is just literally rips his humanity away from him, rips his opportunity away from him to just be. And it made me think about this notion that we talk about around resilience. We expect boys and men of color in the face of impossible circumstances, in environments that are not health promoting, that are not good for their social emotional growth, that don't allow them to be anything other than, conforming to these notions of Black male masculinity. And we expect them to be resilient. Not only do we expect them to be resilient, we celebrate their resilience. And I thought, what an atrocity to expect people to endure trauma after trauma, injustice after injustice, inequality and structural inequity that would break most communities, and somehow still manage to be great citizens, great humans, always get it right. Like, I really started to think about it with my public health, environmental health hat on. And I thought, these environments, we would not tolerate this for most members of our society. We just simply wouldn't. But when it comes to boys and men of color, we just expect them to be resilient. And we celebrate them when they are. And then when they're not, we punish them.
Absolutely. That's so deep, Deb, because the one thing I hate when I'm in a room with people and they're talking about trauma-informed approaches is when someone goes quickly or pivots quickly to the resilience narrative. And I think we get really enamored with the resilience in Brown and Black communities, right? That capacity to bounce back from trauma and adversity. But we forget about honoring the hits that people are taking. Who's honoring the hits that David is taking? Who's honoring the hits that Shinobi's taking, that Ray is taking? No one, really. In fact, we're expecting, the narrative is set up so that we expect that they will figure it out, right? And they usually do, because they're quite bright. Like, they can figure out and maneuver themselves through and around circumstances that many adults can't, which brings me to that scene that you just lifted up of Shinobi in the pharmacy. Here is a young man who's figured out how to be in so many places. He is a shape shifter, right? Like, he can be in a pharmacy, have a conversation with you, charm you. I mean, he has some skill sets that if we were to actually recapitulate those skills and deploy them in another environment, Shinobi could be like Bill Gates or Shonda Rhimes.
He has way more charisma than Bill Gates.
I mean, way more. Those are facts. You see how I corrected myself? I'm like, let's not put up those standards. Actually, Shonda Rhimes or James Baldwin. Let's use those reference points.
But what it points to is his humanity.
Yes, it does.
And his ability to be with and relate to people. And I don't know, you tell me, you're the psychologist, I'm the epidemiologist and the, kind of big public health 30,000 foot view person. We often call that code switching, right? But is it really a code switch, or really is it an opportunity to express other parts of him? Right. This very sort of tender and endearing interaction that he has with this older woman where they're just sort of chopping it up. at the pharmacy where he's going to pick up, we know what's happening. He's going to pick up what they ordered with the pad that they, scripts they ordered from Dr. Bree, right?
Mm-hmm.
But with using his pad. But like, he's a person that's, very well-rounded and has a concern for people. We see that in the way he's so deeply impacted by Willie D's death. Like, these are real human beings.
Absolutely.
Like, where is the deep appreciation for, these are real human beings who express the full gamut of human experience, emotion, and being, and all of that, and can be in many places, not because they're pretending, but because they get these opportunities to express multiple aspects of their humanity. Absolutely. Can you imagine if he had encountered that woman, if she were somehow placed in the ville? Like,
right. Totally different Shinobi would have emerged. And your point is so well taken. It's this idea that we don't see the full range, and you've heard me say this a lot, but like, we don't see the full range of humanity that resides in the bodies, the minds, the spirits of Brown, Black, and Indigenous people, particularly of our boys and men. Yeah. And what we often get are pieces of them, fragments of the self that emerge in spaces where comfort makes itself present, right? So Shinobi can be that charming guy who can have a conversation with a white woman in a pharmacy because he's not in the ville.
Yeah.
The ecology imposes a certain standard for boys and men around bravado and posing, the cool pose, metaphor. And if he were in his environment, he could not be that guy. Yeah. Because being that guy would have put him in danger.
Absolutely. It would have been seen as a sign of weakness. Absolutely. But what an unfortunate state of affairs.
Yes.
When just expressing 360 degrees of your humanity puts you in a weakened position that threatens your literal survival.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And then the very same traits and qualities and ways of being and personas that one has to assemble to survive also become the things that have them be persecuted.
Absolutely.
So I've done a lot of work around like resilience. I sort of steered away from that.
Yeah.
But we used to look at early aggression in Black boys in school. Mm-hmm. And there were all these interventions to try to reduce aggression. And I remember saying, and mind you, I'm just a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, green graduate student with my own lived experience of coming out of a kind of tough environment, and saying, you all are treating all levels of aggression as if it's a bad thing. Right. But some of this is like, there's some level of aggression that's needed for survival in some of these neighborhoods. And you all don't seem to give credence to that. And maybe what you're calling aggression, maybe there's like a continuum, and maybe it's not quite aggression, but you're trying to intervene on something and give people skills, not realizing that the thing that you're calling low levels of aggression is probably actually a very sophisticated coping and survival mechanism that people have had to create because of the environments that they live in. And the comment that was made to me was, well, we don't have good ways to understand and categorize these environments. And they said, so give us some insights. I was literally an undergraduate research assistant when this started. And that's where the Nifty was born from. The work that I did around trying to understand. Now, mind you, that's evolved a lot, because it's not just about being able to check boxes and count broken windows and things like that. The ecology of the places where people live, work, and play. This notion around activity spaces and how people move through activity spaces or don't move around activity spaces, and how they then have to change who they are and what their behaviors are and those things. It's much more complicated than the work that I originally started out doing. But that's where that came from. Because literally a lot of the people who are developing interventions and programs, and the ones who are sort of out in front,
right,
describing how to improve, outcomes for Black boys and men of color, are just so disconnected from what that actual lived experience is. Absolutely. So I think what we get in this episode. And I really love it because when I went back and looked at a lot of them, I was like, this is the everything in the kitchen sink episode. There's a lot in here to unpack.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So much to unpack and to think about the, the complexity of what David is experiencing. Of course, this is, a television series. So some things are happening in rapid succession that probably wouldn't unfold in quite that way, but it is not removed from the truth. I mean, and from reality, which is why I think the series resonates so much with many of us, because you can actually, I know a David, I know a Siren, I know a few Rays, and I definitely know some Shinobis, right? Like, so all of those characters resonate with us because they're familiar. And what I would love if people, for me, what would be a gift as a takeaway from a series like this is that if we could evolve our conversations about resilience and trauma, and that we wouldn't just be talking about the psychological and behavioral adaptation that individuals have to do to survive, but that we would be talking about systems change that would help them heal, grow, and thrive. That's a different, altogether kind of conversation. So it's not about, can David bounce back from the death of Sky? Can Shinobi bounce back from the death of the young boy who passed away, William, in the community? It's really about, how do we fix the systems so that our children don't have to navigate spaces where their safety, spiritual, psychological, or otherwise, is threatened? That's the challenge.
Yes. So I will just add to that from the public health world. I'm like, yes, right on what you said. Once you say trauma-informed care, there's an acknowledgement of the trauma.
Right.
But what gave way to the trauma? What is it about the systems, the structures, the policies or lack thereof, the policies that are in place that have no enforcement behind them, the massive inequity that exists that gives rise to the trauma?
That's
so
right.
If you think about it on a continuum, and I'm very much into the upstream, downstream, the trauma that we talk about is down here. Yes. But the systems and the structures that gave rise to it are way further upstream. Yet all the work that we do to address trauma and trauma-informed care and trauma-informed services places all of the intervention down here as if that's where the problem is.
Yeah.
That's not where the problem is. That's where the problem manifests, because they say the stuff rolls downhill.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm saying, great. If y'all talking about trauma-informed care, we've acknowledged the trauma. Let's have an authentic reckoning with the source of that trauma and start to deal with those factors further upstream that create massive inequity in the places and the spaces where boys and men of color have to live, work, play, worship, go to school, and all of that.
Absolutely. Listen, that is a mic drop moment. And we are 1 hour and almost 20 minutes into this web broadcast tonight. And I love kicking it with you and learning from you and hearing all of the ways, the powerful insights that you bring to bear on some of these social problems. We want to let our guests get to their evening, but we also want to encourage everyone, if you are enjoying the conversation, imagine what you would feel after having visited the syllabus and actually encountered materials that will help you also lean into the conversations and also to host some of those conversations on your own. We are actually going to ask you and actually, and more importantly, incentivize you to go out and rewatch season 1 before season 2 starts next week. Take the syllabus, put it in hand, have conversations with people that you care about, unpack those episodes, and let this be a model for how you co-view a series like this one with your family, friends, and those you care about. We have a lot of work to do in the village, and David Makes Man is a powerful tool for us to have some really critical conversations about the health and well-being of boys and men of color and the communities of women, girls, and children that are connected to them. With that, I just want to wish you all good night. I want to thank you, Dr. Debra Furr-Holden, not only for your conversation and contribution to this webcast, but for your contributions to the field, for all the ways that your work is helping us to better understand how we can shift environments in ways that will rise up to meet our children. Thank you for that and for being such a wonderful mentor and friend. And thank you all for tuning in. We hope you will come back tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. It is the last one of our conversations. I know y'all gonna miss us, but we will try to make it good for you tomorrow night so that we can end on a positive note. Take care of yourselves and those you care about, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Good night, everybody.